folks, and thanks very much for showing up for what is now our second TESS seminar. As always, thanks to Yoko Ishida and Nina Taylor and Andrew Gray Spence for all the hard work they do in making sure that this all works effectively and in a good way. It's a real pleasure today to introduce Jayden Engert. Jayden's one of my PhD students here at JCU. He's a Townsville boy, grew up, so he's a Queenslander. Yay, go the Maroons. We're always make sure that we're getting the right team in there. He did an undergraduate degree at Townsville in biology, and he's done a master's degree with Sue Lawrence here, looking at protected area management, which is what he's going to be talking about today. In his PhD now, which he's working really hard, he's studying the impacts of roads of various types, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, and doing very well. I would actually say this, and wouldn't give a compliment like this lightly. I've had some pretty darn good postgrad students in my time. Few that I can think of that went to Harvard and Princeton. Jayden's probably the most quantitatively strong of all of those. And I just find young people getting more and more quantitative all the time, and it's harder and harder to keep up with them. But Jayden, it's a real adventure just trying to keep up with this guy. Anyway, over to you, Jayden, to talk about restoration planning, scientific ideals versus real world limitations. Thanks.
Okay, everyone hear me all right? Cool. So as Bill said, I'm going to talk about restoration planning and how our scientific ideals often butt up against actual real world implications and real world objectives. So just quickly, again, I did a research project on species composition and restoration in the wet tropics, and I really fell in love with restoration, especially in the wet tropics. So I'm a bit biased towards tropical rainforests, so I'll get that out of the way at the start. But my work to date has mostly involved lots of data analysis, lots of working through records and big data sets. And I'm not a restoration practitioner, so if you have any complaints, I'll direct you to actual experts on that. So broadly, ecological restoration primarily aims to reverse habitat loss and degradation. And Australia is a world leader in habitat loss. I'm sure anyone watching this is probably well aware of that. And habitat loss is also a key threat to the majority of the threatened species in Australia and the world. And restoration also has other sorts of values for species, things like climate regulation, connectivity for accessing climate refugia, and just dispersal through the landscape in general. And restoration also is something that has potential to be an important measure for reducing the impacts of climate change. Again, in a whole bunch of different ways. There's all sorts of different models people have devised about how much it can potentially sequester carbon. Lots of debate and uncertainty about what the actual amount is, but the main point is that it does sequester carbon, and apart from just stopping all carbon emissions, it's one of the things we can do right now. And it also can improve mesoclimate conditions, things like stabilizing local temperatures and rainfall patterns, as well as runoff, things like that. And recognizing the importance of restoration, and also potentially because it's a really good political tool, there's been a lot of big commitments towards restoration around the world, including the UN Decade on Restoration, the Bond Challenge, which aims to bring 350 million hectares into restoration or regeneration by 2050. And part of that is the AFR 100, which is specifically focused in African countries. And there's also many different big national programs, such as in Ethiopia, India, and China. And these are just some pictures. So if you get tired of listening to me, you can just look at the nice pictures of landscapes and threatened fauna. And along with these big commitments and these big programs, there's also been a massive surge in scientific literature, particularly around planning restoration and developing priorities for where we should be restoring. This is one of the fields that I at least pay a lot of attention to as someone who's very interested in spatial science. So I see massive proliferation. Every week I see like another 10 or so articles about where are the best places we should be restoring. And most of these studies tend to focus on the best site selection rather than other things like how best to decide which ones are going to be most successful, and all these sorts of things. And there's a whole bunch of different prioritization objectives that have been used in the past. These are just some of the things that I have seen specifically. Things like species-specific habitat, restoring ecology for biodiversity in general. Carbon farming is something that's becoming very big recently also, as well as ecosystem services and prioritizing multiple different benefits, such as both carbon and water and biodiversity. And there's also been a massive increase in the complexity of different methods in these approaches. So what started out as prioritizing sites for species using things like marksan and zonation has transferred into multi-criteria optimization, things like integer linear programming and weighted sum analysis. And we even have emergence of things like decision science and spatiotemporal models. And a lot of this stuff is well above my head, despite what Bill says about me being quantitative. But an issue that I have particularly noticed about some of these big planning studies is they don't do the best job of considering the limitations to restoration and the constraints on where we can restore and when. This is an example from the recent Strasbourg paper, which I think is very good, but I would like to point out that a lot of the prioritization is in developing tropical countries, which are, of course, very important for biodiversity and carbon storage, but also millions, hundreds of millions of people live here. So it's not so simple to just say, let's restore all of Sumatra or let's restore all of West Africa, because there are massive constraints on actions here. But I'll draw your attention to two papers that I really liked that do focus on these limitations. We've got the Brancalian paper, which looks at how opportunity costs and chances of success will actually limit where we should restore. And the Zhang paper, which looks at a whole bunch of different constraints, specifically land use, financial constraints, operational constraints. And what we can see here is that despite Indonesia being an area of massive priority for restoration, it also has a lot of different constraints on where we can restore based on, 200 million people living here and needing to have productive land. And sorry about that title, my font's going a bit wacky on some slides. But even these studies that focus on the constraints and limitations of restoration are often assuming that decisions will be made based on rational best practices or rational decisions to optimize benefits at lowest costs. But restoration is a highly political activity. There's lots of discussion and uncertainty about how best to do it, where best to do it in the future. And already there's lots and lots of money involved in these projects. So, and lots of political capital also. So deciding where the project goes could be influenced by those sorts of things. And it can also be used as a distraction from fundamental problems such as land cover change. And I've just got a couple of newspaper clippings here that are a pretty good illustration of that, such as the federal government spending more money on advertising about what they're doing to cut carbon emissions than they actually spend on the projects that will cut carbon emissions. So just to dig a bit deeper into the allocation of funding, the 20 Million Trees program, which I'll discuss today, they spent around about $78 million on the whole program. And the bond challenge also is going to be a massive thing. If you use like a rough restoration cost of about $3,000 per hectare for 350 million hectares, that's about $1 trillion that are being allocated around the world. And that's mostly by national governments and large corporations. So who is going to be making sure those fit best practice and don't fit political and economic objectives? And again, as a distraction from the fundamental problems of land cover change and climate change, the 20 Million Trees program across all of the different schemes, they purport to restore about 57,000 hectares. But over 2016 to 2018, in the period the program ran, Australia cleared 900,000 hectares. So the program that we're spending $78 million on is restoring less than 6% of what we lost in the same period it was running. That's not even considering what was lost before and what will be lost in the future. And again, just drilling down a bit on the political side of things, the Australian National Audit Office actually audited the allocation of funding under the 20 Million Trees program and found that it was undermined by weakness in administrative practices, and there was a lack of transparency and a lack of declaration of conflicting interests. So with all that being said, can we actually have a look at how these decisions are being made about where money goes for restoration? And I got my hands on the 20 Million Trees program data, and I decided to have a look at what makes a successful grant application and what factors decide where the money goes. So I looked at the competitive grants round, which included 867 different applications. The 20 Million Trees Landcare program was established in 2014, and it's a federal government program to plant 20 million trees, obviously given the name. And the aim, of course, is to re-establish green corridors, urban forests, and threatened ecological communities. And something that a lot of the people in the Threatened Species Recovery Hub have pointed out is that this was supposed to be most of their threatened species recovery funds have gone into this project. So we would expect it to be doing a pretty good job for threatened species. This is just a brief overview of the different funding streams. I don't know why that picture is so blurry. I copied and pasted directly out of the government report. But as you can see, the competitive grant rounds, while it didn't take as much money as the major procurements, it did have a whole bunch of different projects, and I was able to get information on them so I can actually have a deeper look into that. And then we also have the non-competitive discretionary grants, which is again about another 10 million, and there was no application process for those. Okay, yeah, I've already talked about that. So the information on these funded projects was readily available on like Landcare Australia websites and things like that, but there was no information on the unfunded projects, and it was really hard to get that. I had to submit a Freedom of Information Act request, and what they were able to give me is a quick summary of all the different projects, but they weren't able to give me things like the merit scores or the selection criteria or anything like that. So all of the analysis that I'm doing is based on what I expect they would use to make a decision on how to allocate funding. And using the information that was in the project summaries, things like a description of the location, which state or which natural resource management it occurred in, I was able to map out and geo-reference most of these projects. It was about 95%, which I'm pretty happy with, to be honest. Some of the projects had extremely vague descriptions. I remember one just said, we're going to restore some road reserves in New South Wales. So there are some projects like that that we haven't been able to map out. So we just have to go with the 95% we've got here. And what we can see is that the project applications are heavily focused around populated centres, which kind of makes sense because where there's people is going to be where people have land they want to get money to restore. But the actual funded projects are even more heavily concentrated around these population centres. You can see that in the inset there. I've got this thing, let's see if it works. Here we go. So these unfilled circles are the unfunded projects, and you can see that there's much more spread compared to the funded projects. So to have a look at what went into a successful grant, I got a whole bunch of different covariates from the spatial data and from the project descriptions. Things like the size of the project, the number of trees, the cost per tree, how many threatened species they mentioned in the project description, how many threatened species were actually in the area of the project, potential biomass of the project, things like this. And I used a gradient boosted machine to identify which were the influential covariates that decided which projects were funded and which weren't. And I assumed that the projects weren't going to be selected based on any mathematical relationship or natural law, and boosted regressions are good at dealing with that because they don't really care about the relationship in the data, they just care about what is important. And also I expected lots of really crazy relationships. And these, some of these covariates were also chosen based off the grant guidelines, and two of the interesting ones are that one of the most important criteria they considered was the average cost per tree for restoration. And then to see which projects would actually benefit threatened species, I compared the locations of these projects with the ranges of Australia's species of national environmental significance. For looking at which projects would benefit which species, I only used the likely to occur ranges because it's based on known occurrence points plus dispersal and things like that. But I also calculated how much of a species range had been lost historically, how much of a species range had been lost historically. And I used that to see which species would be most in need of restoration as well. And then to see where we have restored versus what we would restore under an ideal allocation of funding. I used one of these big complicated methods. I used integer linear programming in the prioritizer package in R. And I developed two different models, one that allowed me to only select from sites where there had been a project, either funded or unfunded, and one that allowed me to select anywhere across Australia that needed to be restored. So when we look at what drove the funding allocation, we can see that the two biggest drivers here are tree costs and the number of trees. So what they're looking for primarily is big, cheap projects, which allows the groups involved to say they've met tree targets and area targets at the lowest costs. And something that is also interesting is that the number of threatened species mentioned in the description is more influential than the actual number of species the project overlaps the ranges of. So it appears that it's more important to talk about threatened species than to actually deliver any sort of tangible benefits on the ground. And my model performed pretty well, which is kind of inherent for GBM, so there's nothing to do with me. So when we looked at the overlap of the projects with the species ranges, we can see that only about a third of species actually received a funded project within their range. There are a whole bunch of species that had projects that potentially overlapped their range but weren't funded. And even the ones that did receive projects within their ranges, the actual area restored was very small compared to the area of habitat lost for most species. So on this green and grey figure here, the light green bars are the species for which the restored area is less than 1% of their habitat area. And the dark green bars are the species for which the area potentially restored is more than 1%. And you can see that for most, the area being restored is fractions of a percent. So it's not an amazing return, you would say. And then this is the output of the prioritizer models, which is looking to identify the best places to restore across Australia. We can see that the sites that were actually funded are much more concentrated around population centres than the areas we would ideally prioritise. And we can also see that based on this, the southwestern corner of WA, we have lots of red and black dots here, which are the optimal site selection methods, and not so many of the blue dots, which are the actually funded projects. Again, around Melbourne here, we can see lots and lots of funded projects, whereas based on our selection methods, this was not really considered a priority region. And that's probably something to do with the ranges of threatened species. Most things that occur around Melbourne probably also occur in other areas that would be more optimal to select from. And we can also add up all of these different selection methods and see which ones deliver the best benefits for threatened species. So, and we can see from these plots that the prioritizer methods end up having more threatened species with greater areas of their range restored. But it's still not really a lot compared to that big mass of light green down there. And when we sum up the potential percentages of range restored, and this is hard to control, we can see again that these prioritizer methods deliver better returns for threatened species. So to summarize my findings from my analysis of the 20 million trees data, we can see that the restoration allocation was primarily driven by economic and optical motivators. So we've got to look like we're doing a lot, and we've got to fund a lot of cheap, big projects, but we're not so concerned about if those projects really benefit threatened species on the ground. And also because we're funding the things that talk about threatened species, we're, again, trying to look like we're doing a lot rather than paying attention to the actual locations and ranges of threatened species. And very few notable benefits were delivered for threatened species, despite this program taking a whole bunch of money that was destined for threatened species recovery. And with better planning methods, we could potentially have delivered somewhat better outcomes. But again, the scale of the whole program is just insignificant compared to the area that needs to be restored. So what do these results mean for restoration planning in general? So potentially, by including threatened species by name in the description of the project, we could be seeing some sort of influence of charismatic threatened species. Lots of projects talked about regent honeyeaters, for example, swift parrots, carnabes, black cockatoos. They were mentioned a lot. But there is also no real correlation between the number of threatened species that projects talked about benefiting and the number of threatened species they actually benefited. So this could be some sort of inherent issue with the way the project funding was allocated. And conservation decisions in the past have been driven a lot by charismatic or flagship species. And there's been a lot of work to talk about how that could potentially not be the best way to allocate funding, and how we can do different things to improve that system of allocation. And these results could suggest that we have a similar issue going on in restoration funding allocation. So what can we potentially do about that? Well, there's a whole bunch of priority maps that have already been developed. Maybe we can try and find ways to make sure they get implemented by decision makers. How we do that, I don't know, because I'm not a policy person. But, and another alternative method that has been proposed recently is using specific conservation planning methods to identify what species we should be focusing on as our flagship species. So making sure we pick our charismatic species so that their range will also benefit other species ranges. And that's something that is a new field. Well, not that new, but coming up. And also by focusing on maximizing the returns in terms of area and number of projects, we can often not get the best outcomes. So this is, again, from the Strasbourg paper, showing that when they aimed only to minimize the costs of restoration, they delivered the lowest returns for, what's this one? For the reduction in extinction risk for species. And this is just one of about 4 figures from their paper showing that minimizing the cost never delivers the best returns on any sort of priority method. But what we know is that if you have more projects, you have more people talking about the program, and you have more options for advertising. especially when the government required that the projects, sorry, losing words here, acknowledge the source of funding and support for these programs. And if you're only choosing the cheapest programs to fund, you can be missing out on very important ecosystems to restore, because the cost per restoration is not uniform across different ecosystem types. For example, closed forests and wetland ecosystems tend to be more expensive to restore than things like grasslands and woodlands. And that was actually kind of how I got into this program, is talking to restoration practitioners in the wet tropics and telling me that they weren't able to get funding because their projects were too expensive per tree for this program. But the problem with only restoring these cheaper projects is that the more expensive ecosystems tend to have a lot of value for threatened species conservation, carbon farming, hydrology values, and all these sorts of things. So as you can see from this map here, these different sort of forest and woodland systems around the coast of Australia are the areas that host the most threatened species, but these also tend to be more expensive to restore. So again, by ignoring these expensive to restore ecosystems, you might be missing out on a much greater carbon storage potential, as well as provision of different ecosystem services, such as hydrology and climate regulation. Again, I have to say now that I love tropical rainforests, so I might be a bit biased here. So anyone who's focused on woodlands, please don't yell at me. But also analysis of the monetary value of ecosystem services provided by different habitat types and ecoregions have usually found that tropical forests and wetlands have greater monetary values than different things like woodlands and grasslands. But again, ecosystem service valuations is quite a contentious field. So this is also a bit open to interpretation. But with all these different values of ecological restoration, maybe we should consider those when we decide on allocation of funding. So a project that is going to generate a whole bunch of carbon credits but might be more expensive could be still something that we want to fund if we're thinking about future value, not just the current cost. And there's also potential issues of driving the funding to the cheapest possible projects, such as things like cutting corners, people being forced to cut corners in the way they carry out the restoration. So a lot of the things that improve restoration success can also cost money. So if we're forcing people to make the restoration process as cheap as possible, we might be losing some amount of site maintenance. We might be forcing projects to rely on volunteers only and not having a base of skilled labor to support projects. And it can also drive people to rely on nursery cultivars for plant material rather than collecting seed from local provenances and things like that. And the way corners are cut will also be very variable depending on economic systems and what drives the cost of different restoration projects. So in Brazil and other developing countries, for example, the cost is primarily driven by the inputs. So we might see more of a reliance on nursery cultivars, less inputs such as watering and fencing and things like that. Whereas in the wet tropics, they can be more influenced by the maintenance costs. So we could see less of ongoing weeding and other site maintenance. And these things will all be context dependent, but they can all have different sort of adverse outcomes if we are shifting the way we select projects to fund by the ones that are the cheapest. And I'll briefly touch on the plant quality of the projects, but it's not my area of expertise. But a recent thing from Gibson Roy found that these big restoration projects in Australia will often be driven to use nursery species because there is not enough supply of wild seed. And many of the big restoration practitioners don't want to spend the money that is what that they cost to produce wild stocks. And this can drive down the genetic diversity and also the functional diversity of restoration projects, which can potentially have adverse impacts in the long term. And we have this study from Reynolds. I keep pressing the wrong button, sorry. Where they found that the lower genetic diversity restoration species had lower productivity over, I think it was the first couple of years of the program. But this was also something like a seagrass restoration. So I have to consider that when making conclusions here. And something that is really missed when we drive the funding by the cheapest projects is that restoration is not just a money sink. This is an investment. It produces value, it produces jobs, it produces carbon credits. So the World Resources Institute, which is not exactly a green group, even found that for every dollar invested in restoration, they generated about $30 of economic benefits. And some studies have even found that in a lot of places in the developing world, restoration and proper carbon credit funding could make restoration more profitable than agricultural land uses. So something we should be working towards potentially is developing better, more streamlined carbon credit systems. And also a report by the Climate Council in Australia found that a big restoration program could employ a few thousand people across Australia. So it's not really just something that we're sinking money into. My text is hidden. So something we can potentially look at doing to mitigate these economic incentives in funding allocation is also talk about the economic benefits of restoration projects. Things like biodiversity benefits, ecosystem service benefits, carbon credits. And there's already some sort of pilot programs for these, including the reef credits, which is federal government scheme. No one's shaking their head at me. And the cassowary credits, which are run by Turn. And they are both aimed at giving people incentives to restore or regenerate forests, even not including the carbon benefits. But something that we also have to remember is that we can't work too hard to commodify nature completely, because nature has all sorts of other different values. And if we're focusing on some utilitarian sort of optimization method, we're probably going to keep pushing towards economic incentives, and we're going to lose a lot of the inherent values of nature and restoration in general. And again, we don't want restoration to become some sort of greenwashing scheme, as has often been said about biodiversity offset programs. And the last thing I want to quickly allude to is that my model picked up some sort of potential influence of political motivations in the funding allocation. A lot of the funding went to a few specific electorates, but something to also remember is that a few specific electorates hold most of Australia's cleared land, and a few specific electorates hold a lot of threatened species. So disentangling the political influence from the actual restoration need is something that I was not able to do, but I'm sure there are people who would know what to do about that. So, quick conclusion. The restoration funding allocation was influenced primarily by economic considerations, and this also potentially an influence of charismatic species meant that the funding allocation wasn't really the ideal way that we would allocate funding, and no threatened species really drew much of a benefit from the program. But with a better allocation, we could have had some better outcomes. But again, the scale needs to be much, much greater. And that's something that a lot of people have been talking about recently out of like the UQC CBCS. So potentially some way to mitigate some of these drivers of funding allocation would be to work on better ways of understanding the economic returns of restoration and considering those when we choose which projects to fund. And thank you for the people who helped me map out 867 projects all over the place. And thank you all for listening and not falling asleep.